it's not humanly possible for a Supreme Court justice to paw through all the primary sources you deal with, as well as the other primary sources that others deal with. It's not possible for a justice to produce an opinion that convincingly demonstrates why your theory is right and also refutes the other alternative theories that have been offered on originalist grounds. So there could be concerns, I think, that your paper may have, or your book could have the perverse effect of reinforcing slaughterhouse at the Supreme Court, because they're already scared to wade into this morass. Yeah. And by adding to the cacophony, you have yet another originalist theory of the privileges or immunities clause out there that they're going to have to engage if they decide to do it. Your book could also have the perverse effect of undercutting the case for originalism, because originalism's supposed advantage, or one of them, is that it creates meaningful constraints on judges and judicial decision-making, as opposed to living constitution methodologies, which give judges a lot more freedom to do what they want. And what we see in the privileges or immunities debate are so many different scholars, all of whom are claiming to be originalists, and many of them truly are, but reaching very divergent conclusions on what the evidence means. So I want to make a constructive suggestion, which you may or may not like this, but perhaps you could say at the outset of your book that you're not necessarily calling on the Supreme Court to replace slaughterhouse with your theory, but maybe instead you're suggesting that this court could and should take a step back from slaughterhouse, but in a way that allows Congress to choose from these different historically supported theories of the clause. Yours is one of them. It's very elegant. It's normatively attractive. But Congress could equally choose John Harrison's theory if they wanted to with their enforcement legislation, or Philip Hamburger's theory, or Akhil Amar's theory, or so on and so forth. That might be something that's easier for the Supreme Court to swallow if they see your new contribution to the debate.
Evan?
So, first of all, I thought this was fascinating. I learned a lot from it, and it's going to help me with the project that I'm currently working on, focusing on the Due Process Clause. I have a question about the exclusion of religious freedom from your list of protected privileges, which you describe, sorry, I'm losing track of it. You offer the following description: anterior rights pertaining to the human being as creature of God, conscience, religious freedom, both free exercise and non-establishment. That sounds like natural rights to me. But you have a couple of things that I would describe as at least traceable to, or actually are, natural rights listed among the privileges of U.S. citizenship. So you have freedom of speech, which is traditionally a natural right, and you have the right to bear arms, which is downstream from the natural right to self-defense. So how do we get, I mean, the evidence is what it is. If one category was understood to be a privilege and one was not, then that's fine. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about how what thinking might have gone into that differential categorization.
Christopher Green?
Okay, so just a couple things. But I've got at least 3 dozen things. So one thing that would be nice, I think, just a desideratum of an interpretation is, Jonathan called it elegant, but I think it needs to be a little more elegant. So just simplicity is a super important virtue. So the way I kind of think of it, you've got all these data points, and you're trying to draw a curve that hits as many of the data points as you can, or gets as close as you can. But it can't. You could hit all of them if you're willing to be a sufficiently crazy-looking curve. But it should be a curve. So in my view, which I think is really similar to yours, very similar to John's, is equality of civil rights among all similarly situated citizens of the United States. And you have to textually, you got to infer this tacit reference to similarly situated. So textually, that's a move, but it was done for Article 4. And it seems like that'll cover most of the data points. So distinguishing privileges from immunities, and you got brand and creedal discrimination, which is a lot like religious liberty, but you don't have religious liberty. It has a lack of elegance, or gruesomeness is a word that kind of a pun on Grew from the philosophy of language stuff. But some of the Chomsky stuff about, we just have an innate tendency to speak in relatively simple terms. There aren't that many words in this thing. Like, it can't be that complicated. So anyway, that's one thing. I think Johnson's veto, I think Lyman Trumbull's response to Johnson's veto, I mean, those are super important background. They're not directly describing Section 1, but they're using like the exact same language. And Colfax's speech is super, super important. Stevens gives another speech and says, well, I introduced the thing to the House, but I mean, Schuyler Colfax, he was the Speaker of the House. He knows what it was about. I mean, that is, I think, extraordinarily compelling evidence. I've got a bunch of others of Conness. I mean, this interpretation it's not over and over and over, but it's in there, and it's simple, and I think it accommodates basically all the data points. So, without too much trouble.
The response to Jonathan. Yeah, in terms I agree with you. I have neither the hope nor the fear that either Congress or the Supreme Court of the United States are going to pick up Upham and say, all right, we got a statute, or we got to. I think ideally at the Supreme Court it would happen on an issue-by-issue basis, and the best you can hope for is they could say, there's some serious question as to this being in there or that should be in there, and should we interpret our precedents in this way or that way and not extend them. And that's about the best you can hope for. I'm more hoping that fellow scholars will be motivated by my first chapter in the sense that they can actually find something, even if they disagree with my particulars, that there's evidence of coherence. And that's probably and that I've introduced some new data and maybe some new considerations that will be of some help. Evan, I know we talked about this last night, so I'll try to say it better. I think first, the relationship between the natural rights of Homo sapiens and the privileges of citizens are necessarily going to be closely related because citizens are human beings. And so they bring in with them, and this is a point in Corfield, it's often misread in my opinion, when Corfield says, when Washington says that these can all be found under the general heads. Those are categories, not privileges of citizenship, life, liberty, and this is also found in Douglas versus Stevens, I forget the guy's name, the chancellor. He has an opinion which talks about Declaration of Independence and privileges of citizenship. But what's going to be different is this. The human being's right to keep his head on his body and not have it cut off. For instance, right to life. The right to not be thrown in a dungeon or detained. The right to not have his stuff taken from him is something that our legal tradition, and I think natural law for that matter, and lots of traditions are going to immediately understand as something that belongs to the human being, and being a member or not doesn't make a difference. On the other hand, it makes a big difference whether you have a right to not only leave when you want to, but the right to come into a community and travel around and stay. Once a political community is established, the state of nature is gone. And within that territory, there's territory, there are markets, and there are even rights to participate in deliberations that belong of right to citizens. Aliens might enjoy them equally, entirely, just simply because we're a small government tradition, and we don't take guns away from aliens. And the Michigan Constitutional Convention is a really key moment in American legal history because it's the first constitution that says person with respect to right to bear arms. And there's one line, someone just says, why would we say only citizens here? And Americans are just like, well, whatever, that's fine. All persons can too. They still keep it with respect to speech, which is interesting. But it's a peculiar thing. And the importance of making this distinction is to try to make sense of the evidence that you have in the ratification and in the pre-legal history. I don't know of the thing that I'm doing it's new. It's not that people are making general statements or specific applications. I'm trying to find some theoretical, coherent framework that makes sense of the specifics and the generals, if that makes any sense. And so that's the new and obviously potentially quite vulnerable aspect of my approach. And I just, as usual, harumph, I agree with Chris.
Okay, our next group of three are Stephen Smith, Will Bodie, and John Harrison.
Okay, so David, I sort of approached reading this with great hopefulness for a couple of reasons. One is I don't really teach in this area, really work much in it, and so I think I probably know less about all the specific history of the 14th Amendment than almost anybody in this room. You know, I read Bill Nelson's book a long time ago, and I'll occasionally read an article, you know, by John Harrison or Chris or somebody here or Kurt and so forth. But then students will ask me occasionally about, or other people, this, and I thought, oh, it would be nice to have a book that will give me a sense that I can answer confidently, because I don't even have opinions a lot of times about the meaning of equal protection or the meaning of this and so forth. And I was encouraged in this because early on you said some things about how a lot of modern historians say that the thing was all ambiguous and all this kind of thing, and Nelson kind of suggested that, I think. But in fact, there was a coherent meaning, and most all of them agreed on it. So I thought, you know, this sounds promising. In that respect, it seemed promising for another reason, and that is I thought it might help with a problem I often have in general with certain kinds of originalist theory. So, I mean, it's really familiar, of course, for people to say the original meaning is not the same as expected applications. You know, naive originalists sometimes make that argument, you know, and they say this ought to be unconstitutional because it conflicts with some expected application, but that is not the meaning. You know, you cite Dworkin or Mark Greenberg or somebody, you know, and say sophisticated originalists don't make that mistake. Expected applications are evidence of the meaning, but they are not themselves the meaning. Or Larry Solom, I take it, you know, says that kind of thing a lot. And I understand the reasons for saying that, but I've never been very happy with that because I've always sort of wondered, you know, what kind of thing is the meaning? You know, something that's independent of expected applications, what is that? And it seems like people have in mind something like a relatively comprehensible principle or proposition or idea or theory that has a kind of internal logic or integrity, kind of like what Chris Green was suggesting you might want to buy into a moment ago, that we can understand, and then that we could apply it to different situations and say, okay, these are the things that would follow from it, and the framers, thought X would follow from it, but now, you know, we can apply it and understand how they were mistaken about that. That seems to be the kind of thing people have in mind when they distinguish meaning from expected applications, and your book seemed like it might be offering, you know, promising something like that. But as I got into the book, I had a lot of the reaction that Chris had. You know, it seemed like it got more and more. Well, I should say also, you sort of suggested early on, and I thought he's going to do this in terms of a comprehensible account of citizenship and what it means, you know, and that we've overlooked that, you know, and he's going to spell that out. But more and more things came in, some of which easily mapped onto citizenship, and others seemed more distant, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of that I could pick out, you know, internal logic showing, you know, what the trajectory is. And your outline sort of, I think, confirms me, at least in that impression. And a lot of things on the outlines really seem to be expected applications, especially when you get down to section 3, no novelties, you know, and so forth. These sound more like expected applications. So, if anything, I've come away feeling reinforced but somewhat frustrated in the idea maybe you just can't talk about meanings other than a whole lot of specific application. I understand how unsatisfactory that is, but it seems to me that that's where this leaves me for now, and I know it's unfinished, so I'd just be interested in your reaction to that. So.
William Bodie?
So I normally have a rule against asking more than one question, but you have so much stuff in here that's really interesting. I have two, and I'll keep them both short. So one is, one thing that made me uneasy as I read this is I got the sense that in some ways you were trying to convince me that Dred Scott was right. In particular, the parts where Chief Justice Taney says, you know, it can't be the case that African Americans have citizenship because they did, a bunch of things would follow, they'd have all the following substantive rights, and we know that they don't have those rights, and therefore they can't. So I sensed in that some agreement or sympathy for this like substantive view of of citizenship, and a view that it carried with it a bunch of, at least antebellum, carried with it a bunch of substantive rights. And then there are places where you disagree with Dred Scott, but so I was just wondering whether that part of Tanya's logic, which I'd always thought was wrong for the reasons given by Curtis, was right after all, and if it's wrong, how that fits in. So that was just one thing I was just confused about. And then the other, this is something you just talk about a few times in passing, is markets. And you talk about sort of one of the privileges and immunities of citizenship being access to the public's markets, which is how you bring in the rights to hold property and other things like that. But you have a very public description of the market that sounded odd to me, I'll just say. Maybe this is Chicago in my blood, but I think of it as private exchange. I think of a lot of economic transactions as being, two people consent. They're not necessarily any more public than lots of other two-person consensual transactions. And so I wasn't sure if you had in mind sort of a certain subset of transactions are public market transactions governed by the clause, and a bunch are private, and it depends on the kind of, the nature of the transaction, or whether you thought all of them were suffused with publicness, and where that came from, and whether I'm just sort of anachronistic about all this. So,
John Harrison.
David, if you think that the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment requires some form of intra-state equality, non-discrimination with respect to civil rights, there's then the question why, and which does that? The word abridge, or the concept of privileges and immunities? And especially from reading sort of the two-page version, I'm getting the impression that you're thinking that privileges and immunities have built into them an equality, non-discrimination component. And it seems to me that's certainly different from the orthodox reading of Article 4. And Article 4 doesn't need that for the orthodox reading, where it's about interstate discrimination, because its form is the citizens of other states, in effect, have the privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states. And that's like saying A shall have the salary of B. And it's the A and B part that do the non-discrimination. It's not the concept of salary. A salary can be all sorts of different things. Now, it may well be that at some point in the antebellum period, Republicans generated a theory of Article 4, which was not the orthodox theory, that went beyond interstate discrimination with respect to civil rights, and said, no, it guarantees citizenship and forbids discrimination between citizens of the same state. And I wonder, since if you do indeed want to attribute the equality idea to privileges and immunities themselves, whether that entails either the orthodox reading of Article 4 was wrong, or there was change in meaning between the framing and the adoption of the 14th Amendment, or another possibility is that the Republicans had come to believe their own propaganda, and they had an idiosyncratic and not generally shared understanding of how Article 4 worked and why it did whatever it did.
Okay, thank you all. Stephen, I'm sorry I shattered your expectations. You told me it was going to be cool, man, and I somewhat share the disappointment in that respect. I'm hesitant. I hesitate to try to set forth where I stand in the issue of original expected applications. My own belief is, and I simply could not defend it here. I'm not because it's not right, but because I'm weak. Is original what the authors thought it would apply to is included. What they, by their words and their actions, repeatedly indicate it wouldn't apply to, actions taken under constitutional oath, is very highly determinative, and that's the originally denied applications, denied by words or by actions. You have to take that data and then try to find a meaning. And with respect to religion and speech, the separation of this First Amendment issue, it seems to me that the evidence is overwhelming that speech is included. And there's, to me, very strong evidence, some of it's post-ratification, but some of it's within ratification, including Howard's speech, that the religion clauses are not included. So trying to find a meaning from those particulars. But yes, I don't, that's how I think meaning, and I'm something of an original intentionalist. I think that insofar as we have an authoritative, genuinely legitimate representative government, who are making the Constitution, their understandings, not just the secret thing of Madison, but everyone in the legislature, who are not only the authors, but they're also the subjects of the Constitution, which talks not to the people, but to the public servants. What they do and what they say is enough. You can find some supplemental stuff in other things, but that's going to be very important. I forgot to mention the one piece of evidence I think is the most important. The Joint Committee did say what Section 1 was about, and they said it was to determine the civil rights and privileges of all citizens in all parts of the Republic. That doesn't say everything, but it says something about the relationship, obviously, between civil rights and privileges and the clause. Well, yeah, as to Dred Scott, I did mean to say this. Chief Justice Taney and the Republicans would agree, and in fact, all Americans would agree, that if you're a bona fide citizen, you should be able to travel around without a pass or passport, not be subject to racially discriminatory. And there's another bit of evidence, lots of other. He listed as an immunity of citizenship, not to be subject to racially discriminatory criminal liability or racial taxes. But I don't want anyone to go away from the impression I agree with Dred Scott. But his parade of horribles is for the others exactly how life's supposed to be. Free blacks should be able to travel all throughout the United States and speak and bear arms and all of those things he mentions that are privileges of citizenship. As to markets, yes. In fact, I think one of the major reasons American people lost sight of the Privileges or Immunities Clause is because of our deeply, deeply commercial character. And we look at marketplaces as places of private and transnational jurisdiction. And that was true even then. And so the idea that, of course, citizens and only citizens have a right to come here and buy land is something that is at once deeply embedded in our legal tradition, but contrary to our genius as a people. And that's going to be something I hope to include in the concluding chapter, several aspects of the American character that make American citizenship obscure because of the way we think about markets. John, yes, I am inclined to say, and I don't expect people to have read stuff I've read. My doctoral dissertation was on the antebellum meaning of privileges and immunities, and some articles I've written. The idea that there's an orthodox reading, in my opinion, is not true until after Slaughterhouse, and that on the eve of the Civil War, you have deeply contested accounts of what privileges of immunities of citizenship are. Pro-slavery account, the Orthodox account, which is more predominant among Northern Democrats, and increasingly Republicans who are saying certain fundamental rights should belong to people throughout the Union. Not just abolitionists, but the Republican Party's platform and other places. It's done in a way that suggests a disconnect, and that's another problem with the 14th Amendment. The fragility of it arose in part because the foundations from Republican standpoint were alien to our judiciary. And if you base the Privileges or Immunities Clause on top of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and Congress has one idea and the courts have another, the courts were already bound to misread it. I think the primarily is in the word immunities because it's textually stronger. Munitas is a burden. The idea that citizenship gives you an absence of certain burdens, liabilities, is ancient as well as even in Corfield, because Corfield includes one of the immunities as no tax that's not imposed on others. It's one of this discrete immunity privilege, and that strikes me as a sort of a textbook or a central kind of immunity. And when Senator Howe in Wisconsin gives his speech on the amendment, he says, effectively, the Civil Rights Act does not exhaust what we're doing here because he got racial taxes in the form of indirect racial taxes in the form of expenditures, where everyone has to pay taxes, but African-American children don't enjoy school privileges. And I think the Orthodox reading was not orthodox among Republicans and among lots of people until Paul versus Virginia and Slaughterhouse.
Okay. Our next group of three includes Michael Ramsey, Michael McConnell, and Donald Drips.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for this paper, and I don't know very much about the 14th Amendment, so I'm going to try to keep it sort of general. And I think some parts of this question have been asked already, especially by Evan, but I wanted to just ask about the methodology because I was having a little trouble pinning it down. And it seems to be that it's essential to your project that we have this category of the rights of citizenship. But I'm having trouble figuring out how I would decide whether something's in or out. And so you just take any right and think about now how am I going to decide whether it's in or out? Is the question of what did the framers think about this particular right, whether it was in or out, or is it the question of what was the public meaning with respect to the category that they established? So that you would look to the public meaning to find the category, or is the category something that is sort of is determined from examples that sort of creates the category, and then when you have new examples, they either fit into the category or don't based on sort of logical extension from the definition of the category. And so, and I suppose there's some other possibilities too, but I was just struggling to figure out how one determines whether something's in or out, because some of the things that seemed like they were in could as easily be out, at least sort of on as a logical proposition, right? I mean, for example, on bearing arms, I mean, there's certainly lots of countries that don't think that bearing arms is a right of citizens, and as to whether that was actually a right of citizens in the antebellum period, that would be an empirical question, I suppose, which is different from the question of whether they thought it should be a right or not. So you see, I'm just sort of trying to figure out. So, and I guess maybe to keep it abstract though, just if I had the idea that right X was something that might or might not be protected, how would I go about evaluating whether right X was in fact a right of citizenship under your theory or not?
Michael McConnell?
My question could be seen just as a specific question of Mike Ramsey's question, but I'd like to hear more about freedom of religion, both as to what evidence you point to that it's out, and also what could be the theory under which it would be out.
Donald Dripps.
So this is, of course, very stimulating stuff, and it's endlessly fascinating, the history. I guess I have two questions, both short. One is to the extent that the 1866 elections transmitted a different message than the one that you're deriving from the debates in Congress. To what extent should that count? On a purely intentional theory, your story makes sense, but on a ratification public meaning theory, that's different. And so Flack says, you know, and people in Congress intended a major nationalization of civil rights. That was not the story that was told to the people in the congressional elections and ratification. And if people had known about that, they might not have ratified. Eh? So that's one kind of theoretical question. The practical question that I think is interesting is this: by hanging it on citizenship, you risk a problem in the states where you have the absurdity of the non-citizen and the citizen beaten up by the same police officer, and one has an action and the other one doesn't. But if you hang it on citizenship, it has the advantage, I think, maybe, of rationalizing reverse incorporation, expansions of restrictions on federal power, now that citizenship has been defined at the level of constitutional law. But I'm not sure that's true, because Section 1 defines citizenship, but it doesn't say that the United States shall not at any point, right? And so when you think about doctrines like Bowling against Sharp, if you want to preserve those, and it's sort of politically unthinkable about undoing that, I mean, due process has the advantage of being applicable to both sovereigns, and so just in a functional way, that's a story that might survive any pressure of historical evidence.
All right. Yeah, the method, it's just simply Chapter 5 needs to be, and the methodology will be obvious, and maybe I need to make it explicit. It's just, there's enough data that a lot of things can be included because they're mentioned authoritatively by many, or mentioned in higher places. So I could say these things are in. And what would be the evidence of things?
Mentioned by framers or mentioned by people?
Mentioned by people who are acting pursuant to public authority. And I can just skip ahead to Donald's first question. I think the author of the law, that's the intent we're looking for, and the author of the law is all the state legislators as well as the members of Congress. So we're not looking for a framer or a lawgiver, an individual type lawgiver. It would make originalism a lot easier, but it's different from saying the general public, because I not only think it's impossible, but I don't think that's how our system works. I think we're a representative republic, and we operate through representatives, if it's legitimate at all. But yes, so that's that. The methodology is taking seriously their general statements, taking seriously their particular applications they mention, taking seriously their particular non-applications. It won't answer all questions. I am agnostic about right now about school segregation. I found one instance where it very strongly bowed in the Privileges and Immunities Clause in the debates. That racial taxes would be bad, that racially discriminatory expenditures would be bad, that you can do the equality and at the same time keep segregated schools is a question I would just say, I think originalism runs out. I don't think it's a slam dunk either way. And in a certain sense, I don't think the courts can say much. The courts could make a decision one way or the other. As to religion, I will include some things, but let me just, I'll give you a quick for those, in case I drop dead before I can publish it in any of your interest. The statements by all the Republican judges on the eve of ratification in the test oath cases, in which they repeat Story's maxim that religion is totally left to the states, and Missouri can say, "We license your ministers." That maxim of Story's, this is 1/3 where new databases make it easy. You can find all these people citing it in the 1860s and 1870s, including sources that are sometimes cited as incorporationist. That the old story that the states retain full authority over religion. Arguments made from not only the Blaine amendments, but other things you can find online where people are talking about things like, well, we need to do this. About the best evidence that religion is included is that people even have to answer the question. There's a sensibility, I'll say this, there's a sensibility in America that isn't it already there? But the evidence, but that sensibility in terms of published work is authoritatively said no. And finally, the 1880 Republican platform that says emphatically that we need to have a new, now of course that's, at post-ratification. We need some new restraints on the Establishment Clause. It seems so, and also Howard's speech, it seems to me you can't, the evidence of deliberate inclusion and exclusion in his enumeration, the absence of anything I found, and there's lots of things about speech, lots of things about lots of things in public speeches and ratification comments. And for that, but beyond that, the American legal tradition, which always associates religion with human rights and human beings. Even in the slave states, they say every human being. They won't say all due process; they'll say freemen. But when they get to religion, no one's going to say you have to be free to have your free religious freedom. And they won't say it publicly. No one's going to. Even the slave states won't say it, even though it's a practical matter. You don't have religious freedom. A lot more can be said about that, but. The use of the word civil and religious liberty, ubiquitous in our tradition, still found in the 1860s, suggesting there are two different kinds. Lots of other evidence of this. So there would be an interesting question if there's a great disjunction between ratification opinion and framing opinion. And I don't know how it would resolve that, other than I think there's an equality between them that suggests you have to try to reconcile it. You can't just say, well, we know what Bingham thought, so that's enough for everything. And lastly, I understand the Bowling versus Sharp. I don't think, if I were on, I would not extend Bowling versus Sharp. That's the way a judge should do it. But I don't think it helps our political community to keep saying things, in my opinion, that are not true. We also can veil them. So there's one thing difference between public lying and public veiling, and I think elites don't. This is not being recorded, is it? There should be veils. There should be veils over these things, and it would have been absurd. Just as the Supreme Court said, it would have been absurd to say that we can't desegregate the schools down the street, but we can desegregate them all over the country. I might be tempted to go for some extreme version of the Privileges and Immunities Clause includes this, and the District of Columbia is not exempt from it because it was once part of a state, or the Citizenship Clause will force it. I'm not persuaded by it, and I think the answer might be, we have to go back and tell the people what 1954 is. We've got a disjunction here, and you in Congress, the majority of you favor desegregation. I think that was the case. Get to it, and do it faster than 10 years from now, the Civil Rights Act. I don't think that would have shattered our republic. I don't think that would have been all that harmful. I think they've just been telling the truth and letting a political process, which already had to be in place for desegregation to happen, to take its course.
I did just a quick response there, because you and I both spent a lot of time in the historical materials, and I think I saw this in this draft, and it's on the same subject about the bowling question. It's kind of a tough one. In Republican rhetoric, antebellum Republican rhetoric, the discussions seemed, every time they moved to the Due Process Clause, and they did a lot. I mean, that was the major abolitionist argument, that slavery was incompatible with due process, which belonged to all persons. They often equated it with the principle of equality and the equal right to due process. And I think you noticed that rhetoric in your paper. So I'm not sure how much this affects your thesis in the sense that there might be difficult questions about Bowling v. Sharp as a matter of privileges or immunities. But I guess I just need to ask straight out, did you also encounter discussions of due process that included principles of equality? And does that maybe suggest that might be someplace to support the actual decision in Bowling, regardless of your theory of privileges or immunities?
I saw a lot in respect to due process as a correlate.
Because you call them the same clause, right?
They both are. They're the twin children of the
Right.
principle that all human beings by nature have a right to security in person and property.
Right.
They're complementary, and one can be spoken of in terms of the other, which I try to show that why Bingham thought equal protection was in due process,
Right.
and why he combined both of them in some of his speeches as equality. But the equality there is the equality that every human being has. I can't think of anyone in the several hundred years of due process of law, and I'm not saying there's no one, who would say due process of law prohibits unfair discriminations, but permits all types of just discriminations as to life, liberty, property. The equality that's mentioned is the equality in this very raw sense, and to that extent the Civil Rights Act includes it, but the Civil Rights Act involves other forms of inequalities. And the 14th Amendment goes to other forms of inequalities that we routinely discriminate on the basis of residence in terms of, where you can go to school and who's eligible for this, that, or the other thing, where it would be absurd. Everyone would acknowledge it would be absurd that even if somebody snuck into the country on a hot air balloon and had a criminal intent, that it would somehow be okay for any random person to just kill them. They have a right to equal protection of the laws. They're in our jurisdiction, that by itself, and human beings, that's it. And they automatically get that. And that's how it's spoken of in the debates, and I agree again with Chris Green, his study of this. It's limited in that sense, and due process is limited to a similar extent.
So, David, I have a question with regards to the statement you just made. You sort of had an analogy between just and unjust discrimination, and I guess I'm struggling with those concepts because we know one of the issues with the Constitution is its failure to provide a lot of remedies. And so it makes one wonder exactly what is a just discrimination versus an unjust discrimination when there are no remedies, which is usually what helps us figure out that you did something wrong, right? You have to pay some consequence.
Well,
And I'll just extend that to say to some, then that would mean what could look like an unjust discrimination is a just discrimination because there's no remedy for it, right? It's still discrimination, but if there's no remedy, do you understand what the question?
I think I do. I mean, the absence of remedies is obviously a huge problem. And an adjudicatory process might, may force that issue and force it in a way that would allow for a reasonable sense. I sometimes use that word provocatively because of, in my opinion, reading Tocqueville, our democratic passions make us very, very happy and eager to talk about that form of justice that looks like equality. But if Aristotle's right, all forms of justice take the form of both equality and appropriate inequalities. It's not appropriate to have the Supreme Court of the United States chosen by lottery, all citizens in the hat. Or if there's one flute in the whole community and there's only one person who can play it, you don't choose by random. You give it to the better person. And and all people basically agree with this, and all the disagreements in life almost all concern what are the relevant distinctions and what are the irrelevant and arbitrary ones. Distinctions between residents and non-residents, in some respects, we would not only allow them, but we would consider them necessary. If Oklahoma couldn't discriminate on the basis of residence as to who could vote, Texas would just consume it. The DFW area is so much bigger. We just go there on election day and say, thank you. We'll impose a tax on you. We're the representatives, after all. Go back home and collect the revenue from their oil, et cetera. You see, I've been thinking a lot about this, what we could do to Oklahoma. So I guess that's a distinction that I think, and it's a function of our democratic history, that the word discrimination automatically assumes a negative thing, rather than being a human function where we distinguish between that and that, or this and this, or this person. What are your LSAT scores? Not your LSAT scores, and of course, lots of things are open to debate, and that's endless. I think the 14th Amendment is designed to settle a few of those debates, namely some certain fundamental human rights to security and personal property, and then certain forms of discrimination that are not possible among members of the community.
Okay, so I have the time at 4:12, and I am cueless, so I will take that as, but it looks like I am no longer cueless. So, Christopher Green?
I mean, if this is genuine, like, tacit consent, I mean,
2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Lawson's stuff on equality, you've got a pre-existing thing, you've got to treat all citizens equally, so then the Citizenship Declaration brings in that pre-existing principle, and then you get bowling. The reason you don't want to use the Fifth Amendment is because it applies to persons, and you have long-standing, uncontroversial racial discrimination against aliens. 1790 Naturalization Act. It's reaffirmed that racial discrimination against aliens, which supposedly would be violating the Fifth Amendment, is reaffirmed like within weeks of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. I mean, that tradition, if your equality principle is limited to citizens, it just sidesteps the main instance of racial discrimination by the federal government in a way that, I mean, it's much more elegant that way than trying to make the make the federal government be living in this cognitive dissonance all the way from the founding to 1953. I mean, that's, if you got to do it, you got to do it. But we got a lot of cognitive dissonance, but not that much. I mean, that's just too much. So.
You say about the cognitive dissonance, the notion that, here's an example of one, which I think actually obscures the 14th Amendment. Race discrimination as to naturalization laws, constitutional or unconstitutional. Almost all of our history, it's done. It's done emphatically. It's done repeatedly. It's done by the people that authored the 14th Amendment, previsioning a biracial republic. We'll have African and European, but we won't have Asians. We are very, very rightly, very sensitive about the issues of race. We have a major problem in our country's history. And even mentioning racial discrimination, it's just automatic. It's just kind of like, no, you just press the no button. But what it does is it obscures the relationship between the citizenship clause, privileged immunities, and race. It's very important not to discriminate on the basis of race among your citizens. Precisely because, or on the basis of political opinion, precisely because communities regularly do ask who your parents are and what do you believe at the border. But there's a real sort of unjust, I'm trying to formulate this, unjust transfer of border security, as it were, to back inside the community to tell you you're not a member, so you can't do this unless you profess this religion or this political belief, et cetera. But I think we are, sorry, out of time.
Well, thank you all for your questions.
Thanks very much.